Hi, everyone. So I'm finally reading chapter 5. I read chapter 4 and 6, but I skipped chapter 5. So I'm reading I Thought It Was Just Me, but it isn't chapter 5 this time, not chapter 6. I already read that one. So I invite you to go ahead and sit back, relax. I'm going to read chapter 5 of I Thought It Was Just Me, but it isn't. The third element, reaching out. I'd like to start this chapter by sharing 3 letters I received from women who had been applying the concepts in this book to their own lives. The first woman, Letitia, emailed this experience to me. One afternoon, I was on the phone with my mother telling her about a guy who wanted a relationship with me, but in whom I was not really interested. My mother was still in favor of him, and in explaining why, she said, "He likes you even though you aren't skinny. It doesn't matter to him that you are heavy. He still thinks you're pretty." At the other end of the line, my jaw dropped. A few years ago, I'd undergone treatment for an eating disorder. I was seeing up to 4 doctors at a time for it. My mom is well aware of my medical history. The first thing that came through my mind was, wow, a few years ago, this would totally have thrown me into despair. I would have hung up with her and then cried with shame over my size and felt that no one could ever really love me with this body and that I had to be grateful for anyone who did. Having read about shame, though, I realized that both my mother and my weight were triggers for me, and I was able to step back from the situation and see my mother's comments as her poorly executed attempt at support rather than react in anger as I would have in the past. It still shook me a little bit and bothered me that her attitude was so negative, but I had awareness of the situation and I was able to call a good friend to discuss the situation and diffuse the emotional buildup. It also gave me better insight to where so many of my body issues came from. The second piece is a longer letter about putting the elements of shame resilience to work. Dr. Brown, I've been affected by your work in 2 areas. One, I learned to identify what I was feeling as shame, and second, I learned how to act on it by speaking shame. I learned that I'm very shame-based, that I had all of the symptoms of shame that you speak of, but never really related them to the concept of shame. It's kind of like having a lot of strange and disparate symptoms, but not knowing what to attribute them to. If you don't know what the disease is, you can't treat it. When painful things happen, my face would flush, my stomach would tighten, and I would want to hide. But since the situations were all different, even though my reactions might have been the same, I never could specifically identify the emotion I was feeling. So I never really could deal with it. Plus, I was so busy trying my old methods of coping, that is, trying to develop amnesia about the events, that I didn't spend much time trying to figure out what was going on and how to deal with it more effectively. In fact, I was so disassociated from the concept of shame that I wasn't sure that it even applied to me. Somehow, shame was for other people. Only through reading your work was I able to see how pervasive shame was in my life and how it affected. Let me say that again. Only through reading your work was I able to see how pervasive shame was in my life and how ineffective I'd been at both identifying it and dealing with it. My favorite part of the shame resilience theory is speaking shame. For me, that means identifying shame and then dealing with it in a more appropriate way. I now can more effectively identify those situations in which I feel shame. It is usually prompted by a strong psychological reaction, such as face flushes, stomach tightens, and I replay the incident over and over in my head while actively trying to forget it ever happened. This strategy doesn't work well, and years later, the recall of shameful incidents will cause me to wince and flush. But now I'm able to catch myself and label this reaction shame. So now I have a name for it and some effective action that I can take. My most effective action now is finding someone supportive to tell my shame story to instead of holding it in. I love the metaphor of the petri dish, for when I kept my shame silent and in the dark, it grew exponentially. However, exposing it to the light of day causes it to lose its power and even shrink. Now, instead of cringing, I can almost laugh at some of my experiences. Sometimes I'm even eager to tell my shame story to others. Other times, I more reluctantly share my stories. For example, one day I had a group of old neighbors over to my new home. I'd always felt insecure around these old neighborhood friends as they were the type of women that dressed really lovely and decorated their homes to perfection. I was friendly with this group, but always felt a little on the outside, as I cared less about clothes and home decor. In turn, they seemed to view me with patronizingly patronizalist bemusement. Poor bumbling Barbara. I always felt less than in their presence. Well, I had moved to a new home and had spent a lot of time decorating and was very proud of my sophisticated tastes. So I invited them over along with other old friends from the neighborhood. So eager to please and impress that I went really overboard on the food, and my large dining room table nearly groaned with platter after platter piled high with wonderful cheeses, chips, dips, and dessert. However, the party was not well attended except for this one group of women that I was so desperate to impress. So they came and loved the house, and we caught up in our lives. And then there was this table covered with food, and they ate only a few bites. Did I mention they were all thin too? After they left, I was mortified. Up into that point, I had not realized how hard I was trying to impress them and make up for my perceived past poor showing by inviting them to my new place. And now, instead of rectifying the past shame, I created more shame by having this table full of food that was untouched. The heaping trays of food represented my shame to me, and it was piled high and deep. I saw myself as looking foolish and trying so hard to impress this group of women, and I had failed yet again. In the past, I would have tried to hide the shame and maybe thrown out the food as a way to hide my shame. However, with my new skills, I reached out to a friend who I could trust to understand and share my pain. I called her and told her the story and cried. She came over the next day and we ate the leftovers for lunch. After talking seriously about the issues, I was even able to laugh about my attempts to garner approval and joked about the food, and I felt better. Having it all out in the open, I could more clearly see that I was looking for approval in the wrong places, from the wrong people. I could let go of the shame. Today, when I think of the experience, I generally smile rather than wince. I think of my friend and I sitting at the table and laughing and eating the food botched rather than the botched party. This was a real change for me, for in the past I would have stuffed down the shame instead of the food. My husband had an opportunity to hear an abbreviated version of your shame presentation, and that has been helpful as well. We talk shame together and use it to better our communication as a couple. I also think learning about shame has made me a more empathetic person. I've always prided myself on listening to and not judging others. However, knowing about shame has taken that to new levels. I realize what's at stake when someone chooses to share their same shameful stories with me, and I know the damage that can be done by greeting such a story with judgment instead of empathy. So I'm more aware of trying to comfort that person and let them know that all of us end up in the shame soup at times. That I might be the person on shore throwing the life vest this time, but next time I will be in the shame soup and need some help myself. I am so much more aware that this distancing I am so much more aware that distancing from others and using us and them strategies separates people, instills a false sense of superiority. So I am much more aware of the shame of others, and really work to develop compassion for us all. This is an email from a therapist who uses the work with her clients in her personal life. Dear Brene, as a counselor for survivors of domestic and sexual violence, dealing with shame has always been a difficult part of my work. Your work has been a great tool for working with my clients. I use the activities in my groups and with my individual clients. I think the most helpful part of this book for me has been that I am now able to identify shame and how it is affecting my clients more frequently. I have the tools of helping them acknowledge personal vulnerability, using critical awareness, and facilitating their ability to speak shame. It's almost like magic. Being able to dissolve shame and move forward is a powerful part of healing. In my personal life, I've used your work as well. I talk about shame with my friends. Many of them have read your work. Just being able to talk about shame helps so much. Dealing with my own issues of shame has helped me in areas of my life where I feel stuck. As a survivor myself, I've talked to my friends about shame relating to violence against women. But this book helped me identify other areas of shame in my life. The more common everyday areas that it was easy for me to ignore. Being able to talk about my shame, whether it's about my body feeling too fat or about my work not being good enough, is so powerful. It took a lot of courage in the beginning to even bring up feelings of shame. I never want to talk about shame, but every time I do, I feel so relieved. The more I do it, the easier it gets. And usually I no longer feel ashamed. Without your work, I might not have been brave enough to speak. When I read these letters, the first thing that comes to mind is this. I didn't invent the strategies in this book. It's deeply meaningful to know that the ideas presented in this book are helping women, but these ideas belong to others besides just me. I listened to hundreds of women tell their stories and explain their strategies for dealing with shame. I studied their experiences, organized them, and put words to them. To better understand what I was hearing, I studied the work of many different clinicians and researchers. Their work, which is quoted throughout the book and referenced in the notes at the end, makes my work possible. Reading these letters only confirms what I've learned from studying relational cultural theory. We heal through our connection with others. Relational culture theory grew out of a collaborative process of theory building initiated by the scholars at the Stone Center of Wesleyan College. In their book, The Healing Connection, Jean Baker Miller and Irene Stever write, if we observe women's life carefully without attempting to force our observations into pre-existing patterns, we discover that an inner sense of connection to others is the central organizing feature of women's development. By listening to the stories women tell about their lives and examining these stories seriously, we have found that, quite contrary to what one would expect based on the governing models of developing emphasizing separation, women's sense of self and of worth is most often grounded in the ability to make and maintain relationships. The need for connection and the capacity to use these shame resilience strategies is within all of us. And as Barbara points out in her letter, sometimes we're in the shame soup and need help. And other times we are the ones who can throw the life preserver to the person who is drowning. There are certainly real differences that separate us all in many ways, but in the end, we are more alike than we are different. We all need to feel valued, accepted, and affirmed. When we feel worthless, rejected, and unworthy of belonging, we feel shame. Long letters or short emails, letters from young women or experienced professionals, it doesn't matter. The message is the same. One of the most important benefits of reaching out to others is learning that the experiences that make us feel the most alone are actually universal experiences. Regardless of who we are, how we were raised, or what we believe, all of us fight hidden, silent battles against not being good enough, not having enough, and not belonging enough. When we find the courage to share our experiences and the compassion to hear others tell their stories, we force shame out of hiding and end the silence. Here's how 3 women turned their shame experience into connection. Number 1, I got pregnant when I was 16. I always had weird periods, so I didn't even know it until I was about 3 months along. The only person who knew was my sister. I didn't even tell my boyfriend. About a week after I found out, I had a miscarriage. It was really scary. My sister took me back to the doctors. On the way home from the doctor's office, my sister said losing the baby was the best thing that could have ever happened. That was 25 years ago, and every year I still remember that day. The day that would have been my baby's birthday. I knew that I was not allowed to be sad about it because I wasn't supposed to be pregnant. I'm ashamed that I got pregnant, but I'm also ashamed that I wasn't allowed to be sad. Now, when I see someone who's ashamed to be sad, I tell them how important it is to tell someone and let it out. I tell my daughters, my friends, my nieces, anyone who seems to be scared to grieve. Everyone has the right to grieve and be sad. My dad's wife is younger, number 2. My dad's wife is younger than I am, and my mom's new boyfriend has been married 6 times. My family is ridiculous. We're supposed to be comfortable with that, and that's supposed to be okay because all families are crazy. Well, that only works when you're around other people who also talk openly about their families being crazy. When you're around people who pretend their families are perfect, it's not okay. In fact, it's very shameful because they judge you based on your crazy family members. You try to avoid the discussion and start talking about something else. When I see people admit something about their weird family and someone starts judging them and saying shitty things, I jump right in. I start talking about my family. If we all told the truth, no one would feel they were the only one with a screwed up family. I tried to help people in this situation because I've been there and it's really lonely. Number 3, I think not knowing the truth about something is really shameful, especially when you're growing up and you hear things or get bad information. When I was growing up, I thought a tampon could make you pregnant, and if you masturbated, you would become a porn star. I didn't even know how I learned these things, but for 1 year, I wouldn't use a tampon. When my friends asked me why I wore a gross pad, I couldn't tell them because I wasn't sure if the pregnancy thing was true. It's not like I could ask my parents. Finally, I saw a tampon in one of the babysitter's purse and I asked her about it. She just laughed and told me everything about periods, sex, and guys. Parents have no idea what bad information does to kids. When young kids ask me questions or even make reference to bad information, I tell them everything they want to know. I try to save them the misery I experienced. When we don't reach out to others, we allow them to sit alone in their shame, feeding shame the secrecy and silence it craves. Just like we can't use shame to change people, we can't benefit from other people's shame. We can, however, benefit from shared empathy. We don't reach out to fix or save others. We reach out to help others by reinforcing their connection network and our own. This increases our resilience by sharing our story and creating change. When we don't reach out, we'll fuel our shame and create isolation by separating and insulating. Separating, insulating, reaching out, sharing our story, and creating shame. And again, there's a diagram. And just hold on for a second. Now I'll keep going. One of the benefits of sharing our story is experiencing knowing laughter. I define knowing laughter as laughter that results from recognizing the universality of our shared experience, both positive and negative. It embodies the relief and connection we experience when we realize the power of sharing our story. Hopefully, if you laughed when you read the cookie story, you were laughing with me, not at me. That's knowing laughter. Knowing laughter is not the use of humor as self depreciation, or deflection. It's not the kind of painful laughter we sometimes hide behind. Knowing laughter is acknowledging the absurdity of the expectations that form the shame web and recognizing the irony of believing that we, alone, are trapped and entangled in the web. When I think of knowing laughter, I think of the incredible volume of work written by Irma Bombeck and the poignant humor of Kathy, the comic strip written by Kathy Giswhite. Their creative work targeted motherhood and single life captured our vulnerabilities in a way that makes us laugh and feel normal. There's something moving, spiritual, and essential about sharing knowing laughter with people who understand our struggles. My favorite definition of laughter comes from the wonderful writer Anne Lamott. I once heard her describe laughter as a bubbly, effervescent form of holiness. Over the past several years, I've had the opportunity to work with some wonderful graduate students on this project. We spent many hours reading and analyzing interviews and discussing shame. I remember when the research team first started exploring the concept of knowing laughter. Intuitively, we knew laughing about shared shame experiences played a significant role in our meetings. But as we heard an increasing number of research participants talk about it, we were a little surprised. Finally, we realized that the universal language of laughter gave all of us a way to talk about shame, a concept that otherwise resists words and descriptions. Here's what Marky Macmillan, one of the researchers, writes. Laughter is the evidence that the chokehold of shame has been loosened. Knowing laughter is the moment we feel proof that our shame has been transformed. Like empathy, it strips shame to the bone, robs of its power, and forces it from the closet. When we reach out to others and share our stories, we increase our power and potential to create change. For most of us, reaching out to others results in tremendous individual change and inspires some still further to engage in collective change. Creating change. Believing that we truly do have the ability to create change in our lives may seem difficult or even impossible at first, but it is one of the most empowering steps along the path to developing resilience. When we talk about individual and collective change, it's important to realize that not all of us are going to engage in political action, advocacy, or even small group efforts. Some of us may create change by changing the way we interact with people or changing our relationships. Others may raise critical awareness with friends and family members. We need to find a method of change that moves and inspires us. Sometimes, as individuals, our efforts vary depending upon the issue. There are some issues that motivate me to fully engage in collective action. There are other issues when I feel my strongest contribution is making personal change. When we talk about ways to create change, I like to think of the 6 P's: personal, pens, polls, participation, purchases, and protests. Whether we are trying to change something at our children's school, fighting to have offensive magazines removed from our local convenience store, trying to get better maternity leave at work, or struggling to change national policy, the 6 P's work. Personal. Even the most personal changes often have a powerful ripple effect through the lives of our families, friends, and our colleagues. Jillian, for example, started monitoring the shows her children watch and now limits her fashion magazine subscription. Sandra, the woman silenced by her husband's remarks, has returned to debating politics and religion with her brother-in-law. She's also passing down her parents' wonderful legacy of living out loud and proud, along with the tools her daughter can use to effectively deal with the shaming that other people use to keep us quiet. Change can take many forms. There's nothing more inherently political than breaking through social community expectations so we could live our lives at our full potential and helping others do the same. Practicing courage, compassion, and connection in the face of shame is a political act. Pens, write a letter. Most organizational leaders and legislators will respond to these letters, emails, or fax. My friend and colleague Ann Hilbig lobbies for children's issues. She told me that U.S. Congress members need only 12 letters before they ask somebody in their office to research the issue. I send emails all the time. If you see an advertisement that's incredibly offensive, email the company. The National Organization for Women sponsors Love Your Body Day. On their website, they collect offensive advertisements that promote appearance shame, teen smoking, and alcohol consumption. They have a ready-made petition form that they can pass around to your friends and send to the company. The petition reads, "Dear Marketing Director, we refuse to starve our bodies to fit into this year's fashion. We reject your idea of tobacco as a diet aid, and we denounce the diet industry for making us doubt our dignity. We won't be pushed up, squeezed into, reduced, flattened, straightened, or touched up. You will not map my face or my body for the perfect eyes, nose, neck, breast, tummy, hip, thighs, or butt. We will not be cut up like meat for your profit. We're beautiful just the way we are. We know that cigarettes addict and kill. We know that starvation diets rob us of muscle tissue and brain power. We know that the images of women you place in magazines and on TV are offensive, harmful, dangerous, and disrespectful. These ads are an attack on women and girls. These ads are an affront to my intelligence. These ads are an assault on women's equality. Polls, vote. Find out how candidates feel about the issues that affect your life and vote. Participation. Learn about the organizations that support your issues. Join them in the fight. Most organizations make it very easy to stay up to date on issues by emailing or faxing updates. They also help you speak out by offering pre-formatted emails and faxes. You just enter your zip code, send them right from your computer. It takes 2 minutes, and they make sure it gets to the right person. Purchases. The dollar is mightier than the sword. Stop buying from people who don't share your values. Marketing researchers show that women are the decision makers in an estimated 85% of the household buying decisions. Here's an example. About 2 years ago, Ellen and I went to our local video rental store to rent a couple of DVDs. You can tell how old this is. I was reading the back of the movie cases when Ellen tugged on my shirt and asked, "Are they princesses?" I looked down, and rather than seeing one of her regular pics, I saw 3 young women in string bikinis. The title of the movie was something like, "Want Ads? Trouble in the Suburbs?" I grabbed it out of her hands and examined it cover to cover. It was an adult movie. I immediately picked up Ellen, power walked to the register, and asked to speak to a manager. After a couple of minutes wait, a young woman walked up to me and introduced herself. "When did you start carrying these?" I asked. She looked down at the box and sighed. We got the porn about the same time they cut our benefits and extended our hours." She went on to explain that a huge telecommunication company had bought this national chain of video rental stores. After the buyout, they started renting adult movies. She explained that her store received only 50 adult movies, but the stores in poorer neighborhoods stocked hundreds of them. On the drive home, I explained to Ellen why I was angry and why I think some movies hurt girls and women. She helped me cut up my membership card. We mailed the shredded card and a letter to the company's district manager. I found a great online service that delivers DVDs straight to my door, no late charge, and no adult movies. Our old store may never stop renting pornography, but Ellen and I are not participating. Protest. A protest is not always a million people marching on the Capitol. Sometimes a protest is 4 or 5 people showing up at a school board meeting or in somebody's office. Regardless of size and scope, when we come together to ask for what we need, some people will label our actions as protests. If that stops us, we have to ask who benefits by that. In The Dance of Intimacy, Harriet Lerner writes, although the connections are not always obvious, personal change is inseparable from social and political change. I believe that it's true. Reaching out to others allows us to identify and name what we share in common and creates the opportunity for both personal and social change. Barriers to reaching out. As we practice reaching out, we need to be very aware of the barriers that might get in the way. In the remainder of this chapter, we're going to examine the 2 main issues that often present us from practicing courage and compassion. The best way to introduce these concepts is by telling the story of Jennifer and Tiffany. Their stories beautifully illustrate these barriers to reach out and why it's worth the fight to overcome them. When I first interviewed Jennifer over the phone, she and her husband, Drew, were both finishing their MBAs, and they had a 3-year-old son, Toby. Our interview mostly focused on her struggle with speaking out in her predominantly male classes and the shame of sending her toddler to daycare while she worked and went to school every other weekend. I got to meet Jennifer in person several years later at a shame resilience workshop I was conducting. She approached me at a break and asked if she could share an important reaching out story with the group, and this is her story. After finishing their degrees and getting jobs, Jennifer and Drew moved into their first house in their dream neighborhood. They moved in across the street from Tiffany and her husband, Andy. Jennifer and Tiffany both had sons the same age, and Tiffany had a baby girl. Jennifer was pregnant at the time of our second interview. While their sons grew to be best friends, Jennifer and Tiffany's friendship moved a little slower. Jennifer told me things never got very deep between us. It was mostly talk about the kids. I tried a couple of times, but she just didn't seem to want to go there. After 1 year, I didn't know much about her, and she really didn't know much about me. Well, until this whole thing started. Jennifer explained that her younger sister, Carla, had struggled with alcoholism since her teens. Their mother, who was a recovering alcoholic, had called Jennifer to tell her that Carla had been admitted into a rehab hospital and that her mother would be caring for Carla's daughter, Emma, until Carla got out. Jennifer's mother asked her if she and Drew could attend family weekend at the rehab center, and Jennifer assured her that she would be there. Jennifer had never left her son with a sitter overnight, so she decided to ask Tiffany if her son could spend the night. Here's how Jennifer recalled the scene. I walked across the street, knocked on the door, and took a deep breath. Tiffany answered the door, and I asked, my sister Carla just went into rehab, and Drew and I need to go and see her in a couple of weeks. Could Toby spend one night with you? I'd asked my mom to drive down, but she'll be with my sister too. Jennifer said that Tiffany looked shocked. Tiffany quickly answered, of course he could spend the night, no problem. Jennifer was relieved. Then Tiffany's question started. Which sister? I thought you only had one sister. Yeah, Carla. You met her a couple of months ago when she was here with her daughters. She lives upstate close to my mom, answered Jennifer. Tiffany looked confused. Carla, you're kidding. She's so cute, right? She was the one with the little girl. The two of them are wearing matching Lily Pulitzer dresses. Yeah, that's her, replied Jennifer, who was starting to get increasingly uncomfortable, while Tiffany seemed to be trying to put it all together in her head. Here's how the rest of the conversation went. Tiffany, she doesn't look like a person who'd go to rehab. What's the problem? Jennifer, she's an alcoholic. Tiffany, you're kidding. She doesn't look like an alcoholic. What does her husband think? Jennifer, she's not married. Tiffany, you're kidding. What does your mother think? Jennifer, about her being an alcoholic or being a single mom? Tiffany, gosh, I don't know. Jennifer, she thinks Carla and Emma are great, and she's also a recovering alcoholic. Tiffany, wow, that's some family. Very complicated. Jennifer, yes, I guess so. So Toby can stay with you that night? As you can imagine, this conversation didn't do much to deepen their connection between Jennifer and Tiffany, and things would get worse before they got better. A couple of months later, Jennifer and Tiffany's boys started kindergarten. 2 weeks into the school, there was a horrible incident in the carpool line. Jennifer had already picked up her son and was in the kitchen when Tiffany pounded on the door. Jennifer answered the door, and Tiffany excitingly reported every detail of the incident. You're not going to believe this. Did you see the police cars? Did you see the ambulance? Jennifer got so scared. No, what happened? One of the cars didn't pull forward in the carpool line and people started honking. A mom got out of her car and walked up to the car that wasn't moving. A woman was slumped over the steering wheel. The mom started screaming and a bunch of teachers ran up. They thought she was dead. Somebody called 911, and by the time the ambulance got there, they realized she wasn't dead. She was passed out drunk. Can you believe it? Jennifer could barely respond. Her eyes welled up with tears. Oh my God, that's horrible, she replied. Tiffany interrupted her. I know. Can you believe it? At our school, in our neighborhood? I mean, this woman could have killed somebody. She could have run over our kids. I know. I'm almost starting crying too. Just thinking about that crazy woman driving up to our school like that. Jennifer was speechless. Tiffany responded to her silence by saying, I know, it's horrible. I'm devastated too. It happened right here down the street in our neighborhood. Jennifer shook her head and said, I'm devastated for that mom and her kids and her family, but I don't think we're devastated for the same reason, Tiffany. Tiffany, who was looking out the door, didn't respond to Jennifer's comment. She was distracted as she saw another neighborhood pull up in their driveway and say, Ooh, I'm going to talk to Lena about it. I'll see you later. Jennifer was angry and hurt. As she recounted the story, she kept telling me that she couldn't believe that she could be friends with somebody so superficial, so clueless. Tiffany knew that Jennifer's mother and sister were alcoholics, yet she failed to make the connection. Jennifer said, I'll never forget her saying that she couldn't believe that this could happen in our neighborhood, at our school, in front of our kids. Jennifer explained. I wanted to ask her, where do you think this should happen? Whose kids should see this? Their friendship became a little more distant, but this didn't stop Tiffany from asking Jennifer if she wanted to work together on the school's winter carnival. Tiffany pitched the idea by saying that it would be a great opportunity to get to know some of the PTA moms, especially Amber Daniels. Jennifer reluctantly agreed. She figured it would be a good way to ease some of her working mother guilt. Amber Daniels had 3 kids in the school, a 5th grader, a 3rd grader, and a 2nd grader. She was the president of the PTA and, according to Jennifer, about the most perfect person you'll ever meet. Jennifer described her as smart, beautiful, nice, and by all accounts, a perfect mom. Tiffany idolized her to the point that she couldn't even talk to her. Amber had a following of friends, mostly the mothers of older kids. If Amber or any of her friends said hello to Tiffany, she stammered. Jennifer wasn't quite as starstruck, but did find this PTA in crowd a little intimidating. Jennifer and Tiffany were put in charge of the silent auction. One evening after a carnival planning meeting, Jennifer and Tiffany were walking out of the cafeteria when Amber, who was sitting with 2 of her friends, shouted, Hey, come join us for some coffee. Jennifer and Tiffany looked at each other and slowly started walking towards the table. Jennifer laughed and used her Valley Girl voice when she told me about the moment. She said, I kept thinking, oh my God, like, oh, we've been invited to sit at the cheerleader table. They sat down and Amber introduced herself and her friends. Then Amber asked, so do either of you have exciting holiday plans? At this point in her story, Jennifer looked at me and said, Brene, honestly, I don't know what came over me. She went on to say, I looked right at Amber and said, yeah, I'm going upstate to see my family. My sister just got out of rehab, so we're going to spend some time with her and her daughter. She's a single mom and it's hard. Apparently, Tiffany was so taken aback by Jennifer's candid answer that she slumped forward in her chair at the miniature cafeteria table, knocking her forehead against the table. Jennifer told us if she was trying to divert attention from the conversation, she did a good job. Amber even asked her if she was okay. Tiffany pulled herself together, looked right at Jennifer, and said, come on, Jennifer, I doubt Amber wants the details of your complicated life or family. Amber responded by laughing and saying, hey, aren't all families complicated? Jennifer started to reply, but Tiffany interrupted and quickly said, not like hers. At this point, Jennifer said she was starting to feel ashamed. She was staring down at her coffee cup and was somewhat startled when Amber broke the awkward silence by asking, so how's your sister doing? Jennifer described the moment like this. Amber was directing the question to me, but she was staring right at Tiffany with a look that said, you better not say a word. Jennifer quickly answered, better, thanks. Where was she in treatment? Amber asked. Morewood, Jennifer replied. Amber nodded and said, yeah, my husband sponsors a guy who went through their program. It's supposed to be pretty good. Tiffany was speechless. One of Amber's friends started laughing and asking, what about you, Amber, going to any holiday parties this year? Amber and her friends started laughing, and Jennifer told me that she could sense that there was some kind of inside joke at work. Amber shook her head and said, talk about complicated. Amber went on to explain that the previous year they had taken their kids to her mom's house for the holidays. Amber's mother begged them to attend a holiday party hosted by one of her closest friends, who just happened to be the mother of Amber's first husband, her ex-mother-in-law. Jennifer told us that right in the middle of her story, Tiffany blurted out, you've been married before? Amber apparently nodded and just kept telling the story. Amber explained that all of her kids knew she had been married before, but she and her husband were shocked when her ex-husband showed up with his new boyfriend. Jennifer said, by this point in the story, we're all laughing and getting on great. All of us except for Tiffany. She didn't even crack a smile. I almost felt bad for her until she asked Amber if it was hard to expose her kids to the gay thing at such a young age. Jennifer said Amber handled it very well, really well. She explained that she wasn't sure what Tiffany meant by the gay thing, but that her husband's youngest brother and his partner also lived in town and babysat the kids all the time, so the gay thing was a normal thing to their kids. Jennifer described the ride home from the carnival meeting as incredibly uncomfortable. Tiffany didn't say a word. About a week later, Jennifer asked Tiffany if they could talk. Tiffany agreed, and they talked about Carla, the carpool incident in Amber. As hard as Jennifer tried to explain how she felt, Tiffany just kept saying, I don't know why you talk about these things like you're proud of them. Jennifer said, I tried to explain that I'm not proud of them, but I'm just not going to be ashamed of them. I tried to explain to her that I'm working on my shame issues, but she just didn't get it. Tiffany responded by saying, am I supposed to think more of Amber because her husband's an alcoholic with a gay brother and she's been married before? Well, I don't think more of her. I like honest people. When you see Amber, what you see is not what you get. Jennifer said, I got so pissed, I gave up. I knew if I kept going, we'd end up not speaking. From that point, their relationship solely focused on the kids in school. Jennifer did become good friends with Amber. Tiffany remained convinced that Amber was overrated and turned down all of Jennifer's invitations to hang out with them. One morning, almost 6 months later, Tiffany called Jennifer. She was crying so hard that her voice was barely audible. Jennifer ran to Tiffany's house. The front door was open and Jennifer walked in. Tiffany was sitting on the kitchen floor sobbing. I was sure someone had died. I sat down next to her and asked her what happened, Jennifer explained. Tiffany looked at Jennifer and said, I'm not perfect. I'm really not. My life is as fucked up as everyone else's, I swear. Jennifer said, I must have looked shocked because Tiffany angrily said, yes, I said the F word. That's right. I'll say it again, too. Then she just started sobbing even harder. Jennifer held Tiffany and said, I know you're not perfect. Trust me. I know. It's fine. It's better than fine. It's great. They both laughed a little, but then Jennifer said that Tiffany turned towards her, held both her hands, and reached out in the most powerful way. Tiffany explained to Jennifer that she really didn't understand. Tiffany explained that she didn't even know her father. She had never seen or met him. She told Jennifer that her mother didn't visit because Tiffany was too ashamed of her, so she didn't invite her. Tiffany said she doesn't have normal problems like the kind you and Amber laugh about. She's poor, she's missing teeth, she doesn't speak like us. I didn't grow up in the neighborhood like this. No matter what I did growing up, no matter how good my grades were or how hard I worked to dress nice, I was still shy. When Tiffany met Andy at college, he was everything she wanted. He had the seemingly perfect family, and he taught her how to look good. Tiffany went on to tell Jennifer, I didn't even invite my mom to my wedding. Andy met my mom after we were married. He didn't like her either. He hates where I'm from. It's not like I told him that I wasn't sure what to do about inviting my mom to the wedding, and he tried to talk me into inviting her. He said it would be easier on everyone if she didn't come. At this point, Jennifer and Tiffany were both crying. Tiffany told Jennifer, I want to be normal, but I'm exhausted. I keep it all in because Andy would freak out if anyone knew our problems. I miss my mom. I don't know what to do. I want to be able to talk to you. Jennifer told me, I didn't know what to say or do. I just sat and listened and cried. Jennifer said the hardest thing was when Tiffany stood up and walked over to the drawer in the kitchen and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She looked at Jennifer and said, when you told me you were working on your shame, I Googled the word shame. I found this poem. If you read it, you'll understand me better. Do you want to read it? Jennifer said she could barely force herself to look at the paper, but she read it. It was Vern Rutzlo's poem, Shame. I had never heard of it until Jennifer gave me a copy. I've since shared it with several people, and I do believe it's one of the most courageous acts of telling the truth that I've come across. This is it. This is the shame of the woman whose hand hides her smile because her teeth are so bad, not the grand self-hate that leads some to razors or pills or swan dives off beautiful bridges, however tragic that is. This is a shame of seeing yourself, of being ashamed of where you live and what your father's paycheck lets you eat and wear. This is a shame of the fat and the bald, the unbearable blush of acne, the shame of having no lunch money and pretending you're not hungry. This is a shame of concealed sickness, diseases too expensive to afford that offer only their cold one-way ticket out. This is a shame of being ashamed, the self-disgust of the cheap wine drunk, the lasset that makes junk accumulate, the shame that tells you that there's another way to live, but you are too dumb to find it. This is the real shame, the damn shame, the crying shame, the shame that the shame of knowing words like glory are not in your vocabulary, though they litter the Bible you're still paying for. This is a shame of not knowing how to read and pretending you do. This is a shame that makes you afraid to leave your house, the shame of food stamps at the supermarket when the clerk shows impatience as you fumble with the change. This is the shame of dirty underwear, the shame of pretending your father works in an office as God intended all men to do. This is the shame of asking friends to let you off in front of one of the nice houses in the neighborhood and waiting in the shadows until they drive away before walking to the gloom of your house. This is a shame at the end of the mania for owning things, the shame of no heat in the winter, the shame of eating cat food, the unholy shame of dreaming of a new house and car, and the shame of knowing how cheap such dreams are. As you can imagine, this marked a huge turning point in Jennifer and Tiffany's relationship. The first few times they were together after this sharing, they both felt a little awkward, which was to be expected. Jennifer said, "At one point, I knew this would be easier for us to pretend that afternoon didn't happen, but we didn't. It was too big." According to Jennifer, she and Tiffany are best friends today. Jennifer's family is still complicated, but aren't they all? Tiffany and Andy are in couples counseling. Jennifer said that Tiffany threatened to leave if he didn't go, and that would be worse for his image than going to counseling. Tiffany and her mom are working on mending their relationship, and that's been very tough on both of them. Amber didn't run for PTA president again because she decided to become a yoga instructor. Jennifer laughed. She has a huge following. Tiffany and I take her class together. In this next section, we'll look more closely at the concept of insulating and otherness, two of the barriers that we face when we try to reach out. These are two of the barriers that almost prevented Jennifer and Tiffany from building the connection they now seem to value so deeply. These barriers affect all of the shame resilient elements. If we don't understand how these barriers work in our lives, shame resilience is almost impossible. Let's start by exploring the concept of insulating. Insulating. In a culture of shame, we are constantly overwhelmed with feelings of fear, blame, and disconnection. This creates an us and them world. There are people like us, and then there are those other people. And we normally work very hard to insulate ourselves from those people. Oh, those people. As children, there were the people that we were allowed to hang out with, and then there were the other kids. There were the people we were allowed to date, and then there were the other kids. There were the schools we went to, and there were schools for the other kids. As adults, we live in neighborhoods where our kind live. The other neighborhoods are for the other folks. We emotionally and physically insulate ourselves from the other. It never seems to end. We've developed language to describe the others. Sometimes we refer to them as those people, or the even more mysterious people like that. I seldom use the word truth because it's a strong word with a lot of promises behind it. But in this instance, I'm going to use it because out of all the other things I learned in the past decade, the one concept that I believe has the biggest potential for helping us overcome shame is this: we are those people. The truth is, we are the others. Most of us are one paycheck, one divorce, one drug-addicted kid, one mental health diagnosis, one serious illness, one sexual assault, one drinking binge, one night of unprotected sex, or one affair away from being those people, the ones we don't trust, the ones we pity, the ones we don't let our children play with, the ones bad things happen to, the ones we don't want to live next door. In fact, let me prove my point. If you or your family members have never experienced any of the following issues, you should just skip the remainder of the chapter. Addiction, alcohol, drug, food, sex, relationships, etc. Any mental health diagnosis, depression, anxiety, eating disorder, bipolar, attention deficit disorder, etc. Any stigmatized illness, sexually transmitted disease, obesity, HIV, AIDS, domestic violence, physical, emotional, verbal, sexual assault, rape, marital rape, date rape, etc. child abuse, physical, sexual incest, neglect, emotional, etc. Suicide, violent death, criminal activity or incarceration, serious debt or bankruptcy, abortion, non-mainstream religious beliefs, poverty, including class issues, low educational attainment, lacking basic literacy skills, dropout, etc., divorce. Okay. Statistically, everyone should still be reading. This is a list of otherness, and like it or not, we are on the list, some of us multiple times. You may read this list and think, she's got to be kidding. Just because I'm divorced doesn't mean people think of me like they think of someone who just gone to jail or somebody who's on drugs. Not true. For some people, divorce may be worse than drug addiction. In fact, I interviewed a woman in her early 60s who told me that she often felt ashamed of her kids. Specifically, the most shame she felt was about her daughter. Her son-in-law caught the daughter having an affair and divorced her. This same woman had a son who spent several years or several months in jail after getting a second DUI at college. She compared the two by saying, boys will be boys, I can live with that. But having a trashy daughter is something I never get over. I'll never get over. The point of this list is not to rank or compare the issues. As I've mentioned before, I don't think that gets us anywhere. It's about understanding that we are all vulnerable to being judged and feeling shame about our experiences. And equally important, we are all vulnerable to judging and shaming others about their experiences. I've interviewed recovering drug addicts who have had high levels of resilience about the stigma attached to their addiction. And I've interviewed women who are envied by their friends, but can barely function under the shame of coming from the wrong side of the tracks. Every single one of us is someone else's other. Jennifer and Tiffany are the perfect example. Jennifer's family history of addiction, Amber's marital history, and the women who passed out in the carpool line were all others for Tiffany. They were those people. Remember how she told Jennifer, Carla doesn't look like an alcoholic, and how she just kept repeating how upset she was that the carpool incident happened in our neighborhood, in our school, and at our school. Tiffany couldn't accept the other in her friends because she denied it so fiercely in her own life with Andy's encouragement. She tried to pretend that her mother and the poverty she grew up in didn't exist. She had worked so hard to create a world she could never be perceived as the other that she couldn't accept otherness in Jennifer or Amber. We use this concept of otherness to insulate ourselves and to disconnect. This is why it is such a serious barrier to reaching out as a method of shame resilience. Reaching out in either direction is tough. Practicing courage is as difficult as practicing compassion. They both require us to lean into our discomfort. It was hard for Tiffany to tell Jennifer the truth about her life, and it was also painful for Jennifer to listen. But she forced herself to do it because Tiffany and her relationship with Tiffany were important to her. Sharing our shame with someone is painful, and just sitting with someone who is sharing his or her shame story with us can be equally painful. The natural tendency to avoid or reduce this pain is often why we start to judge and insulate ourselves using otherness. We basically blame them for their experience. We unconsciously divide people in two camps, worthy of our support or unworthy. When somebody is feeling shame over one of their otherness issues, we don't feel that compelled to reach out. Likewise, when we are feeling shame because we are experiencing one of those stigmatized issues, it is difficult to reach out for support. It's easier to believe we deserve our shame. The concept of labeling people worthy or unworthy is not new. If you look at the history of charity in philanthropy, I can't even say it right, going as far back as written history, those needing help have always been separated into the deserving poor or the undeserving poor. This thinking has become part of our culture. You can see it in our public policies, our neighborhoods, and in our families. It plays out as an individual level, exactly like it plays out in the community level. Let's go back to the carpool story. Let's say the woman who was slumped over her steering wheel had suffered a major heart attack and was hospitalized. How many casseroles do you think her family would have received? While she recovered, how many neighborhood moms would have offered to drive her children to and from school? Given the reality that she was passed out drunk in her car in the carpool line, how many casseroles do you think her family received? None, I'm guaranteed. If she was admitted into a rehabilitation facility, what's your guess on how many neighborhood moms offered to drive the kids or set up play dates while she was recovering? My guess is not too many. That's my guess too. I'd say absolutely zero. The story is very familiar for Betty, a woman I interviewed a couple years ago. Her teenage son committed suicide. Even though she had a large network of friends and colleagues, very few of them attended her funeral. She vacillated from tears to anger as she told me just 6 months before her son died, my coworker's daughter was killed in a car accident. She was the same age as my son. The funeral was standing room only. You couldn't move. Scott had as many friends as this young girl. He was on the yearbook staff and active in school. I'm as close to my coworker as this girl's mother, but because Scott committed suicide, no one came. Betty said, I was so hurt and so furious that I finally asked one of the women at work why so few people came, why only 3 coworkers sent cards. She told me they thought I needed more privacy. They didn't want to make it harder on me. Betty drew a deep breath and said, let me tell you what that means. A lot of them think it must somehow be my fault. They didn't know what to say. They didn't want to deal with it. Just too scary. Fear is also another reason we insulate. As my husband Steve reads through this other list, he shook his head and said, yep, these are the issues that we judge and blame people for. Then he thought for a moment and asked, what about those issues that we don't really blame people for, but scare us and send us running in the other direction? I knew exactly what he meant. Sometimes we don't turn away from people because their experiences are so stigmatized and socially unacceptable, but simply because they're too scary. My story about the NICU is a good example. I first became aware of my own fear-based insulating when my husband was in his residency. Steve was spending the month in neonatal intensive care NICU. On the nights he came home, he would tell me stories from the NICU. I found the courage to listen only because I knew he needed a safe place to process his grief and celebrate his successes. After a couple of weeks of stories about dangerous deliveries, dying babies, and grieving families, I became less empathetic and more freaked out. It didn't help that I was 6 months pregnant with my first baby. I started asking him questions about each family, mostly questions about their race, income, and medical history. Fearing I would seem insensitive, I would disguise these questions as concern and interest. I want to picture them. Do they look like anyone we know? Are they our age? It must be expensive. Do they have insurance? Is there a medical reason this happened? One day, sensing Steve's frustration with my litany of bullshit questions, I did away with the niceties and cut straight to the demographics. What race, poor, drug users, prenatal care, genetic problems? Steve looked at me and said, no, Brene, they look just like us. This happens to all type of people, even people just like us. I started crying. No, it can't. I didn't want to believe it. I wanted to use every existing systems of differences to separate me from those people. And if by some strange chance they matched us on all the descriptors, I would move to the next step. Well, then what did they do wrong? After Steve confronted me about my efforts to separate myself from those people in the NICU, I realized that I often relied on that technique when I watched the evening news. If I'm in the kitchen cooking and listening to the news on TV in the living room and a horrible story about rape, murder, or child abduction comes on, I often fly into the living room, whisk in hand, to see what the victim looked like and where it happened. The second I spot something different from me or a neighborhood far from mine, I feel a little less fearful. One day, when I was discussing sexual assault with my students, we started talking about how often victims of sexual assault are re victimized during court proceedings. I told the students the defense attorney don't want the jurors to relate to the victims, what she looks like, her age, her race, where she was when the assault happened, etc. Fearing the jurors may relate to her, the defense attorneys attack her character so that no one would want to relate to her, I continued. I'm sure that's easy to do. I wouldn't want to relate to her because that would mean it could happen to me too. As the discussion progressed, I shared how much I rely on this technique to protect myself. One by one, the students acknowledged doing the same thing, sharing their own stories of how when they insulate themselves in the face of fear. We're sitting in a classroom, it's easy to be outraged about sexual assault survivors, even children, being blamed and ostracized when they are abused. Yet the practice of separating ourselves from others is something most of us do on a daily basis. Unfortunately, as we recognize in finding ourselves on the otherness list, most of us will experience a loss or trauma that others will find difficult and scary. If we spent our lives continually insulating ourselves from the people who are suffering and surviving great losses, what happens when something happens to us? I think most of us turn on ourselves. What did I do to deserve this? Why me? This happened because I did something bad or wrong. Once we convinced ourselves that things like that don't happen to people like me, then when it does happen, it means we've done something terribly wrong. We've been kicked out of the group that keeps us safe, that mythical group that always escapes tragedy. That's why people who survive cancer, women who survive sexual assault, adults who were once homeless, parents who have lost children, and families who have been affected by acts of violence often tell me two things. Before it happened, I never believed it could happen to me. It only happened to the other people. You never know, it could happen to anyone. You never know. It could happen to anyone. I just want to be there for others who are going through the same thing. It's hard. You don't want to connect with people who are in pain, especially if we believe they deserve their pain or if their pain is too scary for us. We don't want to reach out. It feels risky. Just by associating with them, you can either end up in the same other pile or be forced to acknowledge that bad things happen to people like us. I hear the same thing again and again from women who are willing to connect. It's not easy. The women who take the casserole when people are gossiping and judging, or the women who walk through their own fear to comfort someone else aren't superheroes. They are ordinary women who sometimes have to force themselves to do it. It doesn't always come naturally, but they all say it gets easier with practice. My mom is one of those women. I have very vivid memories of my mom being the only one sitting next to a neighbor who was in crisis, not just the acceptable crisis either. I grew up in the suburbs. Trust me, there were some very traumatic events that didn't fit the cookie cutter life that we were all supposed to be living. I even remember being embarrassed sometimes because my mother was the one taking the casserole to the person who everyone was talking about. Or she would invite the family who was swirling in horrible rumors to our house for dinner. I didn't understand it then, but now I get it. My mom grew up with several boxes checked on the others list. As I noted earlier, my grandmother was an alcoholic. She was an incredibly generous and compassionate person who struggled for years with addiction. Back then, alcoholism was misunderstood and a source of even more shame than it is today, especially for women. On top of that, my grandparents divorced when my mom was in third grade. My mom has talked openly to us about the difficulty of reconciling her life with the social community expectation that defined the 1950s. However, somewhere along the line, she found the courage to talk openly about her experiences. Tr- by doing this, she realized she was not alone in the struggle and made the decision to get out from under the shame that was heaped on her by the Ozzy and Harriet culture and its following. In doing so, she charted a new course